Okay, here we go with class number 7 of ethics and law in psychology. And this week I have here, we're going to be doing the ethics of research and publication, and also the research, I'm sorry, the ethics of research and publication, and the ethics of psychological assessment. As I start talking about research and publication, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that topic because um, I think I I think certainly the hope of any university, and certainly the hope of the faculty here, is that as you move on through your academic and then professional careers, that you will consider publications. Now, I will, as we go on here, certainly talk about the ethics of research in the more traditional form, which is you have a lab, you teach at a university, you uh, if you don't have a lab, you certainly have a center where you have subjects come in and you collect data on hundreds of subjects and you do uh, uh, research studies. Certainly, that would be the traditional view of research and then subsequently publications. Uh, but I do realize, as I think everybody at CIHS does, that most of the students who graduate from the PhD program here, that would not be the path you take. Certainly, if that's the path you're looking to take, that's great. Uh, but most students at CIHS are looking to take a more traditional um, clinical path. And so I wanted to spend a good deal of time here when I talk about research and publication on the ethics that would be particularly applicable if you are doing science, if you are conducting scientific research or conducting or writing psychological papers uh, in the context of a clinical practice. In other words, not as a traditional researcher, but as a clinician, but writing up papers as you go along, possibly on doing research on interventions you find to be helpful, possibly case studies, um, maybe doing small scale studies of your own about, who benefits from what type of treatment. All of those factors um, could be helpful uh, to furthering academic knowledge. And I would want to, so I want to talk about the ethics of that type of research and publications when you are a clinician, as opposed to the more traditional researcher position that is associated with a university or a research institute. So where I wanted to start was focus. I wanted to pull up the specific section here, um, 805, which is dispensing with informed consent for research. And what I want to do is talk about each one of those sections in a little bit more detail than what is in the book. So let's start with psychologists may dispense with informed consent only. And let's talk, because here's why this is important. Because most of the time, if you are a clinician and you are writing up an academic paper, you will not be getting informed consent from the individuals you work with specifically to be part of your um, academic paper. So you're writing an academic paper. You may base your research, you may base your findings on information that you receive from clients, but you may not specifically get informed consent from the clients to be part of your academic project. There may be a couple of reasons for that. One may be simply because you don't know when you're seeing the patients that you're going to do this study. I've written several case studies, all and had them published. All of them have been after I finished working with the person. Um, so it may be something like um, I uh, worked with someone, thought that the treatment went especially well, thought there were some aspects of the treatment that other professionals might be interested in. So I go about writing a paper for an academic journal. Uh, so in that case, I didn't get informed consent for the individual to be part of the paper I was writing because I didn't know I was writing it when I worked with the person. That could the other step may be that you want to compare, you want to collect data to compare two different types of treatment. So you may be working with individuals and um, trying different types of treatments with different individuals. But again, not knowing at the time that you're going to write it up. Maybe you're only doing it uh, for your own internal workings, your own internal decision making about what sorts of approaches to use with what populations. And then only afterwards do you see, hey, I think I'm going to I think I'm going to write this up and try to get it published. So in that case, you did a small scale study of different types of treatment, but at the time didn't recognize that you were going to um, write it up as a study. Sort of on a similar note, when I did my internship uh, following my following finishing my PhD academic work, I did my internship at a VA hospital, Veterans Administration Hospital. And there was a lot of research going on there, particularly in neuropsychology. And one of the reasons for that is because there were a slew of records of soldiers who had been given IQ tests back in World War II. And some of those soldiers were now coming back for treatment at the VA. It was in Cleveland. And so VA hospital, that was an example of how that VA hospital provided a um, unique opportunity to compare what happens to individuals as they get older, because now they were coming back to the VA in like their 80s and 90s, and they could be given an IQ test, and they had information about these individuals' IQs when they were in their 20s, which you don't always have. Now, in that case, that's data that is going to be used as part of the study, but there wasn't informed consent at that time to uh, to use that information for research. And what tended to be a problem at the VA is they hadn't gotten informed consent um, when they collected the data in World War II because they didn't know they were going to need it. And now these individuals are coming back to the VA, but many of them were suffering dementia. So they were not in a cognitive state to give informed consent. And so the VA had to be very careful about making sure that they followed all the rules that I'm going through here because they weren't able to get informed consent for using the data for research, because at the time they didn't know that's what they were going to do with it. And now they were having individuals come back, but many of them were not in a cognitive state um, to give informed consent. So in those cases, informed consent could not be obtained. So um, and also um, um, there are other, you also, and informed consent, here's where I'm going with this. Informed consent in this case means not only informed consent, as we talked about before, that that the person knows that the information is going to be used for research, and that they're given their permission to let their responses be known, but also informed consent regarding any harm that might be conducted. Because remember, before we talked about how that's an essential part as well, is letting individuals know if they're going to be part of the study, what sort of harm they may be facing. So when it comes to dispensing with informed consent, meaning when it comes to not having to get informed consent for the person to be part of your study, uh, here's where some of that enters. Here are some of the reasons why you wouldn't need um, informed consent. The first one, as it's written here, where the research would not reasonably be assumed to create distress or harm. Um, and I'm going to go through the three things here uh, uh, separately. The first is they talk about the study of normal education practices, and what that means, and this could be the case in any sort of setting. Certainly, schools would be most prominent, but sometimes all a study involves is watching what's going on, and um, so um, even addressing behavior problems, um, uh, it may not be that anything is being done by the researcher except sort of just watching what's happening. For those of you who were with me last semester when I taught the uh, research course, and we talked about qualitative research, one of the types of research that we talked about was ethological. And ethological um, behavioral research involves just watching what's going on. So basically, what this first one says is if all you are doing is watching what is just going on in a typical classroom setting or in a typical um, group setting, not group therapy, but group setting, then it's not necessary for you to get informed consent because you're not actually doing something. Now, notice here how they specifically mention education settings. And what's noteworthy about that is what isn't in there, because it is not okay to sit and watch a therapy session without informed consent, even if you are not doing anything, even if all you are doing is observing. Because in that case, if say you were doing a research on, well, what sort of interventions work um, best, and you just were sitting down and watching the um, the therapy session, even that would not be allowed, even though your interaction is very minimal. And that's because basically, if all you were going to be doing is observing, it has to be a situation where it could be reasonably expected that just sitting and observing isn't going to impact the dynamic. In an educational setting, that is typically expected to not be an issue because people are just sitting there watching anyway. If you've got 23 students and they're all just watching what the professor's saying, periodically raising their hands, um, then it's seen as not mattering if someone else is in there, even if all they're doing is observing what's going on in the classroom. So if you are observing, basically what this first one says is if you are observing what's going on in a setting where someone sitting and observing what is going on would not be expected to impact what's happening, then it's okay to not get informed consent. Everybody in the classroom doesn't have to give informed consent for you to observe. Okay, and the second one, only anonymous questionnaires, again, naturalistic observations, that's what I just talked about, or archival research. So let me tell you what each one of those are. Anonymous questionnaires, we already know that. That's where the person basically does not give much information about themselves. That's what an anonymous questionnaire is. Um, Naturalistic observations is just what I talked about before. So it's sort of an extension of what's in that first part. So if you are all you are doing is observing in sort of a natural setting, meaning you are observing in a situation where having someone observe would not seem to be out of the ordinary, then it's okay to not necessarily get informed consent. And then the third one there, archival research. Archival research is the term for what I was talking about when I talked about the VA. That in the VA, so this idea of just going, basically, archival research is when you go back through the records and obtain information, as long as you are not using information that could identify a person. So you can use, sort of demographics, but you can't use any specifically identifying information. And I want to just go through in that part what all those examples, uh, what all those examples um, have in common. Uh, they are all situations where getting the responses from individuals would not put them at risk of any sort of criminal or civil liability, damage their financial standing or employability, damage their reputation, or let other people know what they have said in a way that could identify who they are. So basically, when you're obtaining data for um, uh, for research without obtaining informed consent, it is essential that you are doing all you can to make sure that the participants remain anonymous, that other people don't know who they are. Okay, and um, the third type of situation is one where you're studying maybe what's going on in a work environment, but you're not doing it in a way that would affect the person standing in the organization or their job status. So notice how those three things, even though they are slightly different in what they're addressing, one is addressing schools, collecting data in schools. The other is collecting data uh, specifically sort of treatment centers, because that's where you might use archival um, research, but also other settings where naturalists or it the second one addresses treatment centers because that's where you would go for archival research, but also makes note of other types of settings where naturalistic observation wouldn't be a problem. Like I said, naturalistic observation would be a problem in a treatment, in a therapy session, but there might be other sort of like um, treatment settings, sort of large inpatient settings where naturalistic observation would not be a problem, would not be expected to impact on the treatment in any noteworthy way. Um, so schools, treatment centers, and work settings are the three examples of where you might be most likely to try to collect data without getting informed consent. Okay, so um, let's talk about now when you do have to get informed consent. We talked previously, and I believe we'll make reference to this again later as well, about this whole idea of informed consent for therapy and what has to be there, and how, in fact, sort of ongoing throughout the course, we've talked about how important it is to um, provide details in your informed consent so people know what they're getting into and what to expect when they enter into therapy with you. But when it comes to um, when it comes to research, informed consent is similar in terms of it's a form that you have people fill out. Usually, it's a form and you have them sign, and it lets them know basically what they are getting into. So, what I wanted to just review here, and I'll be adding a few additional points, is under 802. Basically, um, what is supposed to be an informed consent. Now, notice what they do here. They make reference to the earlier stuff that we talked about in standard 3, where we talk about what to consider when conducting research as far as ethical issues related to um, research. But here they talk about how that translates into specifically what you need to have in your informed consent when you're conducting research. So I talked for a good part about in what situations, when you don't have to get informed consent. Now, what I want to talk about is when you do have to get informed consent, what's supposed to be in it. So, and they've got it listed here, but I want to just go through them because I want to add a few comments. So, what's supposed to be the purpose of the research, expected duration, and procedures? So, basically, you have to give the person some general idea of what you're going to do and how long it's going to take. Now, it can be a little tricky because sometimes you want to keep the information about what this is for somewhat vague because it's one of those things where if the person knew exactly what the research was going to be, then it might impact on the responses that they give. But it's just generally seeing that you are giving them at least some information uh, to whatever extent you can about what this is about, even if it's just very general that you're studying social relationships or you're studying factors that impact test results. Something even general like that can be fine. Um, but you should also include expected duration and what the person is going to be expected to put up with and what they're going to expect it to do. Second, informed consent, the right to decline and to withdraw. That's important. You have to make it clear to people that if they start a study, that they can quit whenever they want. That's one we didn't really talk about. When I talked towards the beginning of the course about some of the historically problematic research studies that led to the development of ethical principles. One criticism that came up almost across the board with all of them about the ones that were negative and most problematic and were thought to maybe have caused the most damage. One thing that came up as across the board criticism was it wasn't made clear to participants that they could quit whenever they wanted. So there was an impression, a pretty strong impression that they had to continue. They had to see it through. That if they started, they couldn't just walk away and say, I don't want to do this anymore. because a lot of the research studies, if you think about it, what we talked about before, um, the Stanford prison experiment, um, the Seligman study, um, all of them, if there had been a chance, if there was any chance that the person knew that the people involved in it knew that they could walk away, they probably wouldn't have been nearly as damaging as people think they might have been, because people would have just left. They would have said, well, this is getting a bit too tough, so I'm not going to do it anymore. Okay, so next, the foreseeable consequences of declining or withdrawing. Now, you want to let people know that they can withdraw, but um, you also want to let them know if there might be some consequences if they walk away. Because one of the things, if you remember when I talked about research towards the beginning and the ethics of research, is the uh, the importance of meeting with individuals afterwards to explain what went on and what this was all about, in more detail, to let them in more about why you were doing what you were doing, to tell them. It's called debriefing, by the way. Debriefing is when you meet with the person and you tell them um, why they just went through what they went through. And if someone just quits and walks away, then they're not going to go through that. So it is important for them to know that, if you walk away, you're allowed to, but, you know, you maybe, let them know that they should still come back for the debriefing, even if they don't finish the study. Uh, and that's important, to let them know what might some of the problems might be if they don't stick around to the end. Now, um, that is sort of a carryover from medical research. Medical research, that's a bigger thing. If someone's taking a medication, even if it's made clear to them that they're legally allowed to walk away, they need to understand as much as possible that's a bad idea. If you start a medication and then 2 weeks into it decide I'm not going to do this anymore, and just leave, that could be really dangerous to do. I mean, there aren't that many psychological studies where walking away would cause um, real damage. Maybe you might argue with some treatment research, stopping halfway through is, you're not going to get the full benefit of whatever treatment you're receiving. But it doesn't happen that much in psychological research. But it is important to bring up if there is some sort of foreseeable problems that might occur if the person walks away. Um, okay, so other things. Um, you need to make sure they are aware as much as possible of any factors that maybe might have impacted on their willingness to participate. So, if, for instance, you're going to have a study that for whatever reason is going to require the person to stay up for 24 hours straight, even if you don't delve into much detail about why they're being told to do that, it is important that they know ahead of time that they are agreeing to uh, stay up for 24 hours. That's important for them to know, even if they don't know all the details about why that is part of the study. So you basically want to be sure that you are not holding anything back in terms of things that are going to be expected of the person that you would have a reasonable that there would be a reasonable expectation that you would know, hey, if this person knew they were going to have to do this, they might not have agreed to participate at all. Okay. Um, you want to make sure that your informed consent gives them some idea of some potential benefits of the research to whatever degree you can do that. Limits of confidentiality. If you cannot guarantee that the person's name will not somehow be connected with the results for whatever reason that might be, then you want to let them know that. You actually probably a better example of a limited because there aren't that many situations in psychological research where you would have to give out identifying information. It's interesting. I think one of the most clearest limits of confidentiality that you want to bring up is the same as the limits of confidentiality that go with therapy. That if somehow in the midst of this we find out that you're actively suicidal, we're going to get someone involved who can help. If during the course of this we find out you're going off to shoot or you're thinking of shooting somebody, we're going to take whatever steps we are required to take. Um, so you want to make sure that the person knows the limits of confidentiality. Then also in informed consent, it's important to let the person know who they contact if they have any complaints or any additional questions. So that's what you include in the informed consent part of any sort of research that you conduct. Okay, now there's two other aspects of uh, ethics involving research and publication I want to talk about here. And the one in a little bit more detail, and the one is in 812. And given that you all are graduate students, it's important to keep this sort of thing in mind. That the bottom line, I mean, you can see the details here, um, but the bottom line is credit for research goes based on their contribution to the project. So a graduate student who writes a dissertation and then works with the professor to get the dissertation published as an article, not just as a dissertation, at the school, but as an article. If it's the student's dissertation, if it's the student's research, then the student is listed as the primary author. Um, and even if there would be some reason to expect that the paper might be considered more quote unquote important if the professor were at the top of it. Now, I don't mean to bring up that this is important for you to know as a graduate student because I imagine this would ever be an issue at CIHS. I mean, I'm sure that, I mean, I know everybody follows all the rules adamantly, and everybody at the university would be happy to have students publish things that they're listed as that would be happy to have their students be the primary author on anything that got published. Because that reflects better on the students, reflects better on the university. But this was an issue many years ago. Actually, was a smaller reason, but certainly a reason why the ethical principles were deemed to be necessary. Because you'd have a lot of situations where, graduate schools, the professor would chair a dissertation, and then every time the students would try to get the paper published, the professor would insist that they be the primary author. Um, which wasn't fair to the students, because and I'm assuming you know this, but some of you might not. When you work in academia, your status as far as having advanced the field, your how you're judged in terms of your academic career is often based on one, how many publications you have had, two, how important they are, meaning how often they've been read and cited in other articles, and three, how many of them were, where were you on the publication authorship list? Were you the primary author of most of them? Were you the second author of most of them? Where do you fit? And so, because of that, there was a real um, issue for decades of students who would kind of be taken advantage of because the professors would take their dissertation, work with the student to get them published, and then take credit as the primary author for those studies. You can't do that anymore, and it's considered unethical. And professors don't do it anymore because they know it's unethical. Hopefully, too, for most of the professors, I know it's just because they know it was the wrong thing to do. But now it's unethical in a very formal way, and in academia, it's a big deal. There's often a lot of discussion about who is the primary author, because to be truthful, um, when you write a paper, everybody kind of wants to be the first author, um, but you want to make sure that you are not that if you are listed as the primary author, it's because you deserve it, um, and not just because you have status or even and not even because you're the quote boss or quote unquote in charge of the project, but that because you deserve it. Um, the other ethical principle that I wanted to stress here is 809, the use of animal in research. I just think it's important because, as I talked to you before, you know, the ethics code doesn't just involve working with humans. There's this section, I believe, a couple other sections where the ethics are addressed as far as working with animals. I also find I've mentioned here that my academic interest is in the intersection of comparative psychology, which is the study of animal behavior, and human psychology, and how they interject and what clinicians can learn from that intersection. So I wanted to go through in a little bit of detail here ethics as applies to using animals in research. So I'll just go through the statute. Psychologists follow federal and state laws in terms of how animals are cared for and what happens when you're done with the animals after the research is over. Um, the second thing is that uh, the second thing is that everybody working with animals in a research laboratory is trained on the proper care of those animals, and it should be on the specific animals involved. If you're working with a lab that uses chimpanzees, and you've worked in labs before, but only in labs that worked with mice, then you need to be trained on working with chimpanzees. Um, there does have to be adequate training for anybody involved in the lab. So you want to make sure people are trained um, in the laboratory animals and how to care for them. Um, when working with animals, you do everything you can to minimize um, any discomfort or pain that they have to experience. Uh, and so you make sure that their living conditions are up to standards. You do all you can to minimize any, like I said, any discomfort that they have. Um, and that you only subject the animals to stress or pain when there are no other uh, avenues available, no alternatives available. Now, that's gotten more attention in recent years with the whole computer modeling uh, issue, meaning that there has been more and more argument about whether there even needs to be experiments on animals, and whether it couldn't all just be done for computer modeling. Now, in my work, in a lot of things I write about, um, I focus more on animal behavior from ethological, naturalistic observations, where you're just watching the animals, keeping track of their behavior, keeping track of what happens in what situations. But there isn't necessarily anything being done to them other than they're being watched. In that case, these ethical principles uh, don't um, apply for the most part, because you're not actually doing anything at the animals except watching them. Um, F is a little about surgical procedures. Psychologists don't usually perform surgical procedures, but if they do, they make sure that all the anesthesia is involved, um, uh, and uh, that everybody's trained, and that everything is followed to the letter. And then, to be honest with you, the last one, which is, one a lot of people have problems with, but it applies, is sometimes there's a need, sometimes when research is done and the research is over, the animals need to be terminated. And when they are, the ethics are that it's done as rapidly as possible with as little pain as possible. Now, that's not making the argument that there should be situations where animals need to be terminated. And in fact, that's a debate in and of itself. Of, have we kind of gone past the time where we need to even have these experiments where animals are being terminated, at least as far as psychology goes. Um, and in fact, almost all of the research anymore that involves large scale use of animals um, probably falls more under neuropsychology, sort of that crossover between neuropsychology and neurology. Um, but still, the ethics are there, and sometimes animals have to be terminated. If they have to be terminated, psychologists need to show that they are doing so in as quick and painless a means as possible. Okay, so that's the ethics of using animals in psychological research. Um, I want to take the last few minutes to talk about assessments. Um, there's a couple. You know what? We'll talk more about the specific ethical principles here in the course. There's a couple just sort of general points that I want to bring up that do apply to the ethics, but may not always be clear from here. When you are conducting an assessment, your informed consent needs to be different, because remember, if you're conducting an assessment, you cannot guarantee confidentiality. I, I'm going to talk about this in the context of the forensic court assessments I do, disability assessments I also do. And one thing I start off with when I'm doing this is particularly the case excuse me, with disability assessment. One thing I start off with right off the bat is making sure people know that, you need to understand everything you say here is not going to be confidential. I'm going to write it in a report. I'm going to give that report to your attorney. That attorney will share this information, will share this report with whoever they deem needs to see it. So, by definition, this is not going to be confidential. I'm not going to share it with a whole lot of people, but I am going to share it with the person you tell me to share it with, and they may share it with others. So, you want to be clear in your assessment informed consent that you are addressing that with individuals. Um, so when you're conducting an assessment, um, you want to make clear what the limits of confidentiality are. Now, one interesting um, factor that comes up and probably gets the most debate when it comes to assessment is that you, and this is sort of reflected in a number of different places in this ethical code, that you have to be clear that there is a scientific basis and empirical support for drawing conclusions based on the psychological assessment. Um, there is one of the more famous psychological tests is called the MMPI 2. And the MMPI 2 is the most widely used personality test. And it tells you a number, there's a lot of evidence that tells you a lot of things about person's psychological function. But there have been a number of court cases where people have sued because they were trying to get a job and their employer used the MMPI 2 to judge whether they thought the person could do the job well. And there was a lot of there continues to be a lot of arguments in the courts that the MMPI doesn't do that, that the MMPI results are not good predictors of whether a person's going to be able to do the job right or not. If any of you have seen the original Miracle on 34th Street, I always get a kick out of seeing that during Christmas because there's a scene where Santa Claus, after hitting someone, is sent to see the psychologist that works for the store, and the psychologist is giving a test that clearly is the Rorschach test, the ink blots. Well, you wouldn't see that in work settings now because there's no evidence that that performance on the Rorschach says anything about whether the person can function adequately in a work setting. Now, you might see in a psychiatric hospital, but a lot of people would say it's inappropriate to use in a work setting because it doesn't relate to work. So, a lot of the questions about the appropriateness of tests and where it winds up in the courts have come in work settings where any sort of psychological test is used to make judgments about whether someone should get a job or not. And there's a lot of argument that there are very few psychological tests that actually say useful information, empirically supported scientific information that the person could do a good job. One other area that comes up a lot is child custody evaluation. I know a lot of psychologists, including myself, who won't get involved in child custody evaluations, in part because there's no good evidence of any sort of assessment instruments that give solid conclusions about the general question of whether someone's a good parent or not. Even the ones that are specifically designed, that are said to be specifically designed for child custody, don't have a lot of strong support for their use for that purpose. Um, so it's real hard to justify a lot of the procedures used for child custody assessments because there isn't a lot of evidence that they are that they are effective for determining who's a better parent. Um, so that's another part of psychological assessment is you need to make sure that there's solid empirical support for using the test for whatever purpose you're going to use it for. um, One other thing, and then I'll stop here, is you have to make it clear that fees are agreed upon and that fees are not based on having one sort of finding or another. One sort of rule I have with my forensic court assessments is I always get paid up front. Um, and the reason for doing that, or at least get some sort of retainer up front or something. And I will tell people my reason for doing that is that way I can't be accused later on of having just said the quote unquote right thing so that I get paid. I make it clear that I wasn't worried that, well, if I don't tell this attorney or this client what they want the report to say, then they won't pay me. You want to make clear that there is no connection between the decision you make and the fee that you're receiving. Um, I've known some people who, one sort of practical application of this is I've known some psychologists, excuse me, some psychologists who were approached by personal injury attorneys and basically offered sort of a rather high fee, but only if they won the case. And psychologists agreeing to do it, that would be unethical because that would mean, or at least it would be very, very difficult to show that wasn't being unethical because a lot of people has interpreted as you were agreeing to do what you could, not to give an honest appraisal about what's going on, but to make the case turn out the way certain people want it to turn out. And that's unethical. All right. I will see you all on Friday. Have a good week.